Hey everyone, welcome to the Amberdata podcast. I'm analytics engineer Chris Martin, interviewing today Elias from Rated. I'm really excited for our conversation today. Elias, you have so much experience. You have such an interesting company that you're running now. I'm really stoked. You are the absolute expert. Let's go. Tell me, how did you get into crypto?
Thanks for the wonderful intro, Christopher. So it all started, I think, in 2013 or 14. I was living with a really good friend of mine just out of university, and he fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and he just couldn't stop talking about it. I didn't really understand it at first. I thought he was crazy and crazy obsessed. But then really the more we talked about it, the more I started kind of like warming to this idea of like, sovereign, non-government money, neutral settlement layer, all of that good stuff, like natively on the internet. But really didn't kind of dawn on me that, wow, this thing is actually important until the summer of 2015. So I'm from Greece originally, and I used to come back to Greece. I still now I live here. But I used to come back every summer. And in the summer of 2015, Greece was really at the really nadir of the financial crisis that really lasted like for most of the 2010s decade. And there were capital controls. The Athens city center was literally on fire, riots everywhere. And so as things unfolded, the government implemented capital controls to the point where every person or family or bank account had a weekly ration of money that they could take out of the bank. And that was about 400 euros a week, or maybe it was even less than that. I can't remember the specifics. And so we're talking about incredibly graphic scenes of families and pensioners and students all sort of being lined up around the corner of buildings. And we're talking about, potentially even like 100-meter long queues at ATMs to go and get like their ration of money. And the ATMs would just, run out of cash. Then overnight, like you'd later find out about these like very long operations and emergency type stuff where trucks with money would come into like the middle of the night and then like fill up the ATMs again so that they don't go completely bust, and then send the populace into even like higher order paranoia. And in between all that chaos, I was like, all right, well, I need to move some money into Greece or out of Greece. Like, how do I do that? Bitcoin, bam, and then really kind of that was a light bulb moment for me. But I didn't really actually start paying attention and devoting all of my time really in this industry until 2017, and kind of the ICO era of Ethereum started kind of as a interest out of trading and these types of things. But the more I learned about the technology, the more I realized like the potential that this has in terms of building a settlement layer for a new financial system that's natively built on the internet, is open and doesn't necessarily discriminate for people to participate. And then really one thing leads to the other, and I guess 6 years later we're almost 6 years, right? It's 6 years.
Yeah,
2017 to 2023. We're here having this conversation.
Yeah, I'm picturing the very traditional like bank run image where everyone's lined up for blocks. Is that what you had?
This was pretty much it. This is pretty much it. I mean, I don't know if you remember like the 2008 financial crisis. I was in university back then in the UK, and it was Northern Rock. I think it was the first bank that actually imploded in the UK. And you would see like these lines outside of bank branches, and it was like all over the news, like really graphic scenes. It was exactly like that.
Wow.
But instead of kind of like the actual branch, it was like really ATMs. Pretty dire stuff. Much better days now, but that was a real moment in the very negative sense.
You went from standing on one block to now standing in an entirely different block on
Yeah.
chain.
That's right.
Um,
That's exactly right.
so you started, you joined Coinbase around what, 2018, 2019? Is that right?
It was the beginning of 2021, actually. So
2020.
my first job in the industry was as an analyst in the first hire at a fund called Decentral Park Capital. I stayed there for about 3 years. I made a bunch of investments. I built the research and data product functions, helped them raise a $75 million fund too. And then I moved on to a company called Bison Trails. I was employee number 20 there. At Bison Trails, I helped build I think at some point, largest platform for validators as a service in the world. And I was a protocol specialist there. I think the second person in the industry to be called that, the first being my friend Victor, who hired me in. And then stayed there for like a little bit less than a year before the acquisition. Then we were acquired by Coinbase on, I believe, February 2021. And I stayed on until April 2022 when I moved on to found Rated.
How did the founding of Rated emerge?
It is a pretty long story that played out in snaps and then kind of went dormant for a bit, and then another snap, and then it started intensifying, and then it was like, okay, well, we got to do this thing. But I love working with data. I'm also quite okay working with data. Not necessarily I'm not the best statistician. I'm not the best in machine learning or data analysis, but I think I'm actually pretty good at kind of the context art, whatever you want to call it, around data, right? Like what data means, what variables you should select, how you present the outcome in order to kind of like maximize the impact. And these are things that people actually don't pay enough attention to many times, right? It's almost kind of like the hidden sort of secret about working with data and doing it well. So data has been kind of a theme, a leitmotif, if you want, like throughout my career from like earlier days, but even, within crypto, I talked to you a little bit about before, that data platform that I built at Decentral Park, when there weren't that many tools actually out there. Then Dune comes along and I became one of their earliest users. Before founding the company, I think I was number 3 on their leaderboard as well. And then I just stopped because now all my focus is going to Rated. And if you put all of that together, sort of my love and sort of affinity for working with data, and then having worked in the infrastructure space for about 2 years, and realizing that there's a real wealth of information that, at least until like a year ago, it had still remained like untapped, not well contextualized, not well understood, a lot of subjectivity, which creates like really coordination issues, right? Because if everybody sees the same thing, but from different angles, then you really have like a communication problem at the ultimate level. And all of these things together somehow kind of led me to realize, well, if we are going to build important things on top of these chains and these systems, then we should really be very forthright about how the actual infrastructure works, right? And we should point like a massive beam of light into the very core of these environments. And so that kind of all was molding and meshing together for several quarters, actually. It all kind of started with a data hackathon that I participated in with my friend Sid Shaker, that back then he had just transitioned into Coinbase. He used to run a company called Token Analyst, one of the earliest data analytics companies specifically focused on Bitcoin, and then they started transitioning to other chains as well. And it was sanctioned by the Ethereum Foundation, and the brief was analyze data, build tools, do whatever with the data that the Ethereum Medalla testnet produced. And the Medalla testnet was the last testnet before the launch of the Beacon chain. And so we did, I think you can still find it. It's still up under eth2data.io. benchmark.github.io. And we did this analysis of everything that happened in the Medalla testnet, from benchmarking the 4 clients that were sort of prod ready at the time, to just looking at, how attestations get propagated on the network, to defining what performance means. And that was really kind of the sort of the spark, right? Where I understood all these things, that there's so much like valuable data and there's a lot of context that goes completely sort of missed, at least beyond like the very small group of people that were, actively developing on developing the chain. And so then one thing leads to the other. After kind of doing that, kept operating as a protocol specialist in the infrastructure layer, kept stumbling upon the same problem that, like, well, in this other network, we don't have awareness and understanding of our context. And so, the best way to see things happen is to go and do them. And that's what I took upon myself to go out and do.
That's amazing. And I think one of the things that, like you mentioned, is everything is open to interpretation. You can use this data in any way that, you can creatively think up. One of the things that I like about Rated is establishing new standards around, especially validator performance. How do developers and operators use these standards to improve what they're doing?
Many ways. So first, it's understanding what their performance even looks like, right? And people, there's different types of operators on Ethereum and in other networks as well, that go all the way from hobbyists to professionals, big companies, venture funded, and so on. Over the years, like, the larger operators have created sort of infrastructure for observability and to understand like how they're performing. But even at the highest level of operation, that sort of broader network context, how we're doing versus our competition, and how do we even benchmark our performance, and how do we create like those feedback loops that sort of happened in informal or semi-formal sort of closed circles of knowledge exchange and so on. With the behaviors that we're seeing now is that at the highest sort of most surface, superficial level, people are coming to the network explorer that we've built, even like, from the highest level of professionals all the way down to solo stakers, to basically both benchmark their own performance versus their own tools, or they take it at face value. They look at it in terms of the network average and how this is behaving on any given day. And it goes all the way from sanity checking to, when you go to deeper levels, to like actually dissecting what the correlates of potentially negative events have been, right? There's these nodes have a bunch of jobs that they need to produce, that they're allocated to by the protocol, and every job sort of has like a little score. You did the job. It's sometimes it's binary, and sometimes it works on the continuum in terms of, how quickly did you do the job, if you did actually do the job. So by going super deep on this like 20 plus metrics in terms of consensus performance, you can actually like start realizing what one instance of potentially downtime might have sort of produced as symptoms, and how it might be different from another. And then by just looking at your own monitoring and observability, things that we can't observe from the outside in, but you as a node operator have, right? Because you operate the machines, and then you log your the data that you produce on, a Grafana dashboard or whatever not. Then you can actually start forming like a much more complete picture of, well, was it me? Was it me and the network because something extraneous happened? And they're able to much more quickly actually come to a realization of what the cause of the observed effect actually is.
And this is sort of real-time feedback as well.
Exactly. Right. So we started out just looking at the historical picture, because that was, I think, especially at the time, the most crucially missing piece. What is sort of at a very high level, how has this operator, or even at the atomic sort of validator level, and an operator being a collection of validators put together, bound together by agency, how have they been performing across the whole history on the network, and how might they compare versus another? And so we started from this like high level view, and just being really two people when we started, we were just doing daily snapshots. I think now we're at kind of like hourly snapshots, refreshing the database, and then progressively, so we're getting sort of very close to the tip of the chain.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I like just viewing the Rated website is it's very intuitive between what you see and how to interpret these things. So like somebody like myself that is not in the validator space, or somebody that's kind of reading these things at a glance and is not super technical on that side of the state, I can take a look at the website and pretty much glance and understand exactly what's going on and how competitors are doing. I think that's a really impressive piece of work that you've done there. From an investor standpoint, how do I use this to make informed decisions? Are there any type of decisions that I can make?
It's an interesting question. There are a few. So, and it really depends on what type of investor you are, or allocator, if you will, right? I will have to caveat that none of the things that I say here on are to be construed as investment advice. But maybe it's worth very quickly defining proof of stake before we actually get into this. So proof of stake is a security algorithm, and it is different from proof of work, which is also a security algorithm. So you have two security algorithms, security being the output. And then while in proof of work as the input, you had electricity and computing bandwidth, how quickly you can do these computations to like break the hash. In proof of stake, you have value at risk, which is the stake. And then you have operational excellence, which means how available can you be so that you can earn maximum rewards. And you earn rewards by performing jobs. And these jobs are all basically point to or sum up to you contributing to moving the chain forward, the next block and the next block and the next block, and doing it in a way that is prompt and in a way that is eventually for the chain at a global level secure, right? So that there's enough people that have witnessed or attested really that this is the state of the chain as it is proposed by the proposer. And the proposer is one of the validators that participate in that consensus game that is handed the duty in every round that this game is played to collect transactions from the different mempools. And then, or that's at least what previously used to happen. We'll get into how it most popularly happens today. But taking these transactions that are effectively communicated to the network by users and then arranging them together in a block format, and then everybody else basically says, yep. Did everybody see what happened? Do we all agree on the state of the world? Cool. Close block, move on to the next proposer, play the game again. So all these jobs give you rewards. The better you do the job. So again, there's a binary, did you do the job or did you not do the job? And then there's a, how well did you do the job? And really how well you did the job mostly has to do with speed. How promptly did you communicate the message to the network? Attributes then to rewards. And then there's also
block proposers, right?
Yeah.
Block proposers are the ones that put the transactions together into a single block, and then you validate those with your validators, right?
That's right. Or if it is your turn, you will be called to actually propose the block, which means that you have to put these transactions together in a block format, but you also have to aggregate enough attestations that you did what you were supposed to do, also pack them in the block, and then just like ship the block towards finality, right? Like you don't actually do that. It just happens. The protocol takes care of that as sort of these attestations roll through. And then when they pass a certain threshold, which I think is 2/3, then it actually moves to towards finality. And finality means that the state of the chain cannot be changed up to that point and looking all the way backwards. So considering then that operators are really incentivized by rewards that the protocol issues to them. So there are two types of rewards. There's consensus rewards for performing all of these jobs. And now in Ethereum specifically, there are also execution layer rewards. Post-merge, validators, it's this proof of stake algorithm that is responsible for securing the chain rather than the proof of work that was there before. So you have this execution layer and users communicating transactions to the security layer, which is the validators. And then a proposer packs a block together and ships it towards finality. Now, all these execution layer transactions have fees attached to them that users pay in order for the transaction to be included. So validators also benefit from that. With the introduction of MEV boost and proposal builder separation, which we can talk about what it is later. And there's also like a notion of MEV existing in the blocks. And MEV in the very in the shortest way possible is outsized value that is being created by rearranging transactions in terms of creating arbitrage opportunities and different, like, you know, capturing like imbalances or being able to inject transactions that take advantage of this particular ordering that someone has come up with. And sometimes both these things, both the fees that are being paid in the execution layer because a crazy NFT mint happens, for example, or because there's a hack. The point is, the value of the block sometimes can be very large, both because of MEV and because of priority fees. And that's largely outside the control of a validator because it all happens in the execution layer, right? So imagine like a crazy NFT mint happens, lots of interest from users. Everybody's like racing to mint first. Everybody's paying more priority fees and is trying to outbid each other. There's a number of reasons why higher fees might actually happen. And so completely outside the control of the validator, it just happens that this block that is being produced has a massive reward attached to it, right? Which is, it can be, from a validator's perspective, it's totally random. You have no control over that. So there is a deterministic aspect then of performance, which is all your jobs that need to be done. And at the same time, there is a non-deterministic aspect of rewards, which is whatever happens in the execution layer, right? So with all of that context then set, how someone might make allocation decisions by looking at the Data Explorer or using a different data is that you can see different attributes about any given operator and make assessments in terms of how well they have been performing, how long they have been active on the beacon chain form, at what scale they're operating, and how many validators they have been running, whether they have been party to slashing events, which is something that happens when your infrastructure is misconfigured. Maybe you've been taking a lot of risk. It's not something that happens very often, but it does happen, and it's a penalty basically that the protocol inflicts on validators that, from the protocol's perspective, are behaving against the network. It's something that kind of slots under like malicious behavior. You're trying to mess with the state of the world as is understood by the protocol, i.e. you're trying to enforce a double spending incident or whatnot. And then basically make an allocation decision accordingly. Now there are different objective functions that might be satisfied. Some people might opt for lower risk. Some people might be opting for high rewards, and this is what they're trying to optimize for. And then if that is like whatever your objective function is, there are useful data that you can index on in order to actually make the best decision.
Yeah. That makes sense. So if we go back to the consensus clients, right? Why is this the distribution of consensus clients and even block space distribution? Why are distribution metrics so important?
So Ethereum is actually quite unique in that Ethereum, the software, has 4 popular implementations. And I think there's even more than just 4, right? And this is what we're referring to as consensus clients. So it's the implementation of the consensus layer of proof of stake Ethereum. And there's 4 clients that actually dominate the majority of distribution in the network. And these are Prism, Lighthouse, Teku, and Nimbus. Client distribution is important because it shows, I think, a couple things. One is the ability of an operator to operate in different parameters. So when you're running, let's take 2 operations, for example, of equal size, say 10,000 validators each. And one is a mono client, and the other one is equally split across 4 different clients. Then it means that you understand 4 different pieces, and their performance is largely the same, right? So all other things being equal, one is mono-client, one is multi-client. The thing that multi-client signals is that as an operator, you have the prowess to be able to operate 4 different pieces of software and understand kind of like their interoperation surface with the machine layer that they operate, or they sort of affect the protocol onto, right? And again, all other things being equal. So on par, I would contend that this multi-client operation is a better operation than the other operation. The second thing that this might signal is risk, right? So going all the way back to the Medalla testnet, this has been, I think, I don't exactly remember, or I don't think I even know some of the earlier testnets before Medalla or Medasha. But the most sort of catastrophic scenario that we've seen happen on any version of the beacon chain was what is known as the Prism bug. And the Prism bug was a bug that existed in a new version of Prism, which has been historically the most popular client on Ethereum. At the time, it was by far the most popular client. So I think 80% of nodes on Medasha were running Prism. And they introduced a new version of the software that had a bug in it. And I think anecdotally, the bug was related to a Cloudflare API that the client was pulling from to kind of like compare blockchain time with real time. That clock went off, and then it sent everything. Like basically, no validator could tell what time it is, and time is actually, like, in terms of blockchain time, a very important parameter in sort of a validator's operation. That, I think, sent about 30% of the network's nodes, or even more, 40% of the network's nodes completely off. The network couldn't finalize for like several weeks.
Wow.
There were hundreds of slashings, tons of penalties. It was like a total mess. And so these things, like the fact that it happened on a testnet, was great because everybody got like a dress rehearsal of what a catastrophic event actually might look like, and got to have a little bit of prep in terms of, okay, well, how do we respond to these types of situations? Now, operators that were just running Prism were just completely whiplashed in the middle of that event, whereas operators that were running some of the other clients actually didn't have an issue, right? The issue that they had was affected by a bunch of blocks that were missed, which means that their attestations were slow, and so they did actually where they were the recipients of a negative externality that the majority of nodes actually produced, but they did keep the network moving forward, and they didn't get slashed, they didn't get sort of undue penalties, and so on and so forth. So in short, a multi-client operation minimizes the risk of, or at least mitigates significantly the risk of being exposed to such like a tail event. And if everybody on a macro scale, if everybody adopts such practices, then it means that the network overall is more resilient, right? And that's why the Ethereum community, particularly in the infrastructure space, is so sort of passionate and adamant about, you know, client diversity and maintaining this diversity in terms of software implementations.
And specifically on operators. So if we look at some of the trends with operators, there's a huge difference in operator effectiveness. So from the top and bottom operators, about an 8% difference. You know, how does how do these operators, I guess, become more efficient than others? Is it simply distribution? Is it running more nodes?
So distribution is specifically with regards to clients, it is really like a tail risk, or at least closer to the tail type of risk mitigation strategy. In terms of becoming more effective in the network, and then it depends on like which view of the network you're looking at, right? If you're looking at like top operator to bottom operator in any given day, or even like across longer timeframes, you will get those deltas. When you're looking at a subset of the professional operators on any given day, the likelihood is that actually their performance will actually be quite, in terms of effectiveness, and effectiveness in really short is a metric that we've put together, which is basically, its purpose is to reflect how well an operator is doing all these jobs that they are actually called to do on a protocol level perspective. So what is their deterministic performance? What contributes to a spread between how operators perform in the network and their effectiveness is a multitude of things. It has to do with how this operator is set up. It has to do with how well provisioned their nodes are in terms of resources. Do they have enough CPU? Do they have enough bandwidth, enough storage? Are they performing upgrades in a safe and prompt manner, or are they not, right? Like, because if some of your nodes are stuck in a previous version of the software, then obviously they're going to start lagging behind, and they're not going to be able to peer with other nodes, or with as many other nodes as they need to, in order to kind of like keep up with the network. There's a whole series of things that attribute to this. So operators that basically keep the baseline of things that they need to have in place in terms of process, in terms of setup, and so on, will perform better than others. Temporarily, you might see performance deltas actually like increase during upgrades, like the Chapella fork, for example, that happened just about a month ago. But also there are ways in which you can juice up your performance, if you will, even more, which then it's really kind of like almost like a marginal diminishing returns curve after a certain point, which is, on the one axis you have your effect in the network, and on the other axis you have your effect on your objective function, right? And you can keep increasing your performance, I think, by doing all of these things that you need to do well. Up to a certain point, you also contribute to the network in a positive way. So both, it's the increasing part of the curve. And then you can start, I guess, doing things like positioning yourself closer to the center of the network, so that your speed of contributing these messages and attestations to the network increases, because your messages don't need to travel around the globe, but they just need to travel kind of from US East to US East Virginia, and these data centers are closer to one another. And so if the network is then coagulating around that area, if you place yourself closer to that region, then you will get better performance. But obviously on the other end, you're contributing to centralization of the network in that specific region, which then starts kind of like piling on the risks in terms of the physical infrastructure. If you're just like, everybody piles on into a specific data center, what happens if that data center catches fire or disappears from the face of the earth for whatever reason, all the way up to regulatory reasons, compliance reasons, and so on, which as you know, at this day and age, they're also part of the consideration mix.
Mm-hmm. And for all of these reasons, does this eventually affect slashing? And are these the main contributors to why an entity would be slashed?
No, an entity would be slashed for misconfiguring their infrastructure, or for taking undue risk in terms of creating redundancy so that they don't experience downtime. So they have like a replica, for example, of their infrastructure somewhere else, so that if that infrastructure, their main infrastructure goes down, then they can fail over very quickly to the other one that's available and not miss a hugely valuable block, for example, that they might be producing, or not miss kind of the opportunity to be attesting and earning rewards. But in doing that, they might be sharing the private key material between the two instances, right? And so it could be that one, the main version of the instance actually communicates something to the network, then fails over, then the other one turns on, and it's time to actually perform a duty. And then in the same time window, this your public key identifier of a validator or whatnot has actually attested to two different versions of reality, because now it's different time, right? So you have version 1 at time t, and then you have version 2 saying something, what it sees, and then you have version 2 at t+1 saying what it sees at t+1. But what happens at t, what your context is at time t, is not the same as t+1. But what the network sees is that in that window where t and t+1 are together, but it is like a one sort of unit of time for the network, you've attested to two different versions of reality. And that, from a protocol perspective, is confusing. If everybody was doing that, right? If we're all playing a game of truth telling, and then in the same round, we're all saying contradicting things, then we're never going to come to consensus. Then we'll never know what reality is, right? And largely, like, reality for the network is majority rule. What the majority thinks reality is, not unlike, the world at large. So these are the instances that one might get slashed for. Or, for example, just turn off all your slashing protections in terms of software, so that you might gain like a little bit more performance, because your local software doesn't need to run all of these jobs. It can do more with less resources and so on. But people are very sensitive to that, and normally operators take really good care to not actually find themselves in these types of incidents.
Would you mind helping us define what exactly is slashing for those not familiar?
Slashing is the instance where you have attested to two different versions of reality, and then the protocol takes away from you an amount of your stake. At the moment, I think it's 1 ETH out of 32, but then you're also exited from the network, right? So until more recently, with the Chapella fork and withdrawals being enabled, that meant that you basically would be accruing penalties until you get exited, and then you would be incurring opportunity cost in terms of not being able to withdraw your ETH until withdrawals were enabled. Now, arguably, the opportunity cost is actually much less.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Switching topics. One of the metrics that I really love that you guys are covering is on your aggregate views network overview. As you get towards the middle, there's the network Gini coefficient. I absolutely love Gini coefficient. One of the things that I would love to see more, and this is something that we're also working on at Amberdata, is Gini coefficients within tokens. In the context of the dashboard here, what does the network Gini coefficient represent?
So, setting context again, the Gini coefficient is like the measure of inequality used traditionally in economics, and it's used to basically index countries along the same index in terms of what proportion of wealth is allocated to what proportion of the population. A Gini coefficient of 1 means that the top 1% have most of the wealth. The Gini coefficient closer to 0 means that the population is actually like pretty equally distributed, right? And it's basically the distance of a curve, an exponential curve, along like a straight line that is sort of the perfect equality line. So the curve could be like either the line, or it could be just the the other two sides of the triangle, and then anything in between. The Gini coefficient of 0.96, which you see on the screen there, means that Ethereum is actually quite unequal in terms of how stake is distributed. But that's only part of the story. So we put this metric there because we didn't have any better data to actually index on. So I think by the time that this podcast will be out, a blog post that we've been working on will be also out. So I do encourage people to go and check our blog, rated.network, and then just navigate to the blog section, and it will be probably the most recent one, which is trying to classify how many solo stakers actually operate on Ethereum. And we have found that while these solo stakers operate about 6.5% of the stake on Ethereum, which is, and again, the difference between a solo staker and a professional staker, in the simplest form you can conceive it, is that a solo staker just runs a validator at home. They use their own capital, and they have that's the extent of their operation. A professional will most likely also be running validators on behalf of others, in mostly non-custodial ways, or even in custodial ways, and so on. And the scale of the operation will be much larger. So commensurate to this, 0.95 or whatnot, Gini coefficient might be pointing to 8% of the stake being operated by these smaller operators is actually like quite small, and it aligns pretty well with a Gini of 0.95. But what we also did find, which is I think the more interesting finding, and I'd love to kind of actually work on a metric like the Nakamoto coefficient, for example, that is much more encompassing of more layers of the network, is that in terms of machines that are operating the network, and again, one important distinction we need to make is that a validator is a digital sort of representation. It's like almost an accounting unit, and many validators could be running on the same machine. So what we found is that in terms of machines, these solo stakers might be operating anything from 40% all the way up to 75% of the machines that operate the network, which basically paints the complete inverse picture of what this Gini coefficient might do for Ethereum, right? And why this finding is interesting is that, well, in the most pessimistic scenario, like the lower bound view of how many machines there are in the network that are actually validating, not counting for RPC nodes or nodes that are just non-active as validators, it might be up to 3,000, right? 3,000 machines actually operating Ethereum at the validation level. Thinking that even at the lower bound of estimation, that it might be 1,000 machines that are being run by people at home and in smaller data centers or whatnot, is just incredibly impressive, right? Considering that there's a whole contingent of chains that run on pretty much like 100 120 machines, and so on, which makes Ethereum really resilient. Maybe you can, if Ethereum has been designed to withstand a World War III type of event and still keep chugging along, considering that you have, 8% of the stake operate like, 1,000 nodes out of like 3,000, or potentially it's even more out of more for the higher bound estimates. It means that Ethereum is like actually slowly finding its way to becoming truly unstoppable, which is a really, really exciting finding that we stumbled upon.
Yeah, and on the topic of decentralization, if we look at the builder landscape, so this is another tab on the rated website, there is about 80% share for the top 3 builders. Does this pose any centralization risks if there's so much within just a small number of entities?
It sure does, but it is also pretty early in this post-merge proposer builder separation era of Ethereum and blockchains at large, if you will. So it's interesting decentralization has many levels, right? So at the node level, for example, at the validation level, what we just talked about right before would point to Ethereum actually being very decentralized. At the stake level, much less so. At the block builder level, and who decides like how blocks get put together and so on, a lot less so. So this is kind of a meta point that's interesting, and it's actually what we're trying to show and make easier to understand with sort of the interface that we've built, is that there are actually all these many different layers, and these layers have their own attributes, and they have their own interfaces, and they have as sort of agent sets that operate in these kind of like separate layers. Like you can think of it as like one agent per layer, really. They have also different objective functions that they need to that expresses sort of their useful life, right? So the short answer to your question is yes, but also it's pretty early. And if we learned one thing about the Ethereum community, is that it rallies behind causes like that, and solutions are usually found because there's a will for solutions to be found and be put into place, even if these solutions mean that, you know, the protocol changes. And this has happened time and time again. I believe that this will be one more of those, and I think in, you know, a few quarters from now, the picture is going to look wildly different. I think, you know, Paradigm just a couple of weeks ago released like a whole open source framework about how to operate searchers, and Flashbots has open sourced their builder, and then this is a lucrative enough opportunity for competition to actually start emerging, and with so many open source tools sort of lowering the barrier to entry, the dynamic will, I think, largely be more competition. But then again, if you consider sort of what the objective function of the builder is and what the inputs are in that agent, they are order flow. The more orders you see, the more permutations you can put together, the higher the value of the resultant block will be, and how quickly you can run, how many of these sort of permutations you can generate in the short span of a block. So that's computing power, really, or how well put together your algorithm is. Naturally, like in every competitive sport, you'll have a power law, and then it, you know, some concentration will still and always exist. But that's also, like, to some extent inescapable. What I'm indexing on is that the whole community is, you know, really thinking about these things in a very top of mind way, and we continuously see improvement after improvement after improvement on all accounts. So that makes me more sort of optimistic than pessimistic about how this story might pan out.
No, that's amazing. In terms of Rated, you know, what's the future look like? Are you guys looking into other networks, or is it deepening the scope of the platform?
All of the above. So the way we kind of bottle up everything that we do is under the title reputation for machines. So I'm not going to be very prescriptive about telling you what might be what might exist down the line for us in the short, medium, and longer term future. But really, the vision behind what we're building is to instantiate this idea for reputation of machines, right? And largely reputation is things like performance, risk, externalities. In an AI context, they might even be alignment. But my mission and our mission is really to bring this to bear in a way that is well contextualized, well articulated, transparent and open and easy to understand, and is affected in ways that can create value. This idea of reputation can be funneled into products in different execution environments, whether these are on-chain or off-chain, and help basically consensus in all different sense of the world, from kind of like the very core on-chain consensus to consensus about opinions and objective functions and so on, to actually kind of flow through without objections, and for really different opinions to find their way to instantiate themselves online, on-chain, offline, and so on. So, you know, the world is becoming increasingly so machine dominated. And, you know, I see our mission as kind of, again, shining like a bright beam of light in how these machines and their operators actually behave as constituents of their respective networks.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be following up with you in the future as you build this out. There's just so much interesting stuff, and this is extremely informative. One last question for you. What's one thing that we in the crypto community aren't talking enough about, but should be?
Wow, that's a really good question. Actually, here's what I think people are not talking enough about. People are not talking enough about how far we've come as an industry in terms of like real adoption as well, right? People are talking a lot about how we are not adopted enough and how we're not AI yet, but they're really not talking enough about how much useful stuff people have built, and how many new people are sort of onboarding into these ecosystems and the different use cases. And sure, like things like Pepe coins and meme coins and all these things always like have a place in the world. And by merit of this being financial technology at its very core, speculation runs rampant, right? But you know, people don't talk enough about everybody in Venezuela just operating on crypto rails, because their economy situation is pretty dire, as it were, as is the case like in many places in Africa, as is the case in India and so on. People are not talking enough about how, you know, open source software, which is like an amazing movement that has like lasted through decades, is sort of being accelerated by crypto and blockchains and all these things that we're working on. People are not really talking enough about how this also might be part of a solution in terms of, you know, how do we keep AI agents, for example, in check? And how do we know that they have been sort of aligned across history, or across history in terms of their useful life, with whatever sort of the objective function of their operator or whoever they are supposed to be there to help. So yeah, there's actually like a lot of these things that I think people are not talking enough about. But I think that's also justified because there's so much more sensational stuff that people can index on, like, you know, the latest meme coin just making somebody a paper trillionaire in the span of 5 days. Sure, I mean, you know, and there's like, you know, there's either a spectacular blowout or a silly in terms of context and numbers and everything, story like that, like every other week. So these finer narratives just get drowned out in sort of the superlative of these sensational things that, you know, seemingly keep happening every week.
What an amazing answer. Yeah, that's fantastic. Elias, we're out of time. Want to thank you sincerely for joining today. What an amazing conversation. I learned, you know, an outrageous amount of of things today. Would love to follow up and talk more in the future about, you know, what Rated's doing and what they're looking at. I think there's just so much going on, and these standards are an incredibly important thing for everyone to focus on and center around. So yeah, thanks again for joining.
I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks very much.